My name is Joe Balyeat. I'm a lifelong Montanan from a family of 14 and was born and raised in the state and raised on wild fish and wild game. I'm a certified public accountant by trade, but I've done a lot of writing and eventually went on to serve in the Montana House of Representatives and the Montana State Senate. I was chairman of the House Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Committee, and I was vice chairman of the Senate Fish and Game Committee. Carried a lot of legislation that would be considered positive by hunters and anglers in Montana, including I was the one who wrote and sponsored the bill to put the right to hunt and fish into the Montana Constitution. It was my position and the position of the 80+% of Montanans who voted for it that the very purpose of constitutional rights is to guarantee rights for minorities, especially if they will become an increasing minority. And even though Montana has the highest percentage of any state in terms of the adults participating in hunting and fishing activities, still hunting in particular is a declining activity in Montana. I think it was 25% of Montanans participate in hunting and angling, Montana adults, and that percentage had dropped by 7% in the previous 5 to 10 year period. And so it was our position that we should put this right in as a constitutional right so that we couldn't face at some point in the future just the majority by whim just abolishing the right to harvest wild fish and wild game. There are other states that had it before then, and there are other states, many other states, that copied what we did here in Montana and put it into their constitutions as well, like Idaho, etc. I believe the wolves will reintroduce themselves on their own to Colorado, and in fact I believe that wolves introduced themselves to Montana before the formal, quote, reintroduction of wolves. There's already much evidence that wolves were already here. The real debate is that the wolves that were reintroduced into Yellowstone were a larger breed of wolf. They were a Canadian gray wolf as opposed to a timber wolf. It was a much larger breed, and many of us who are active hunters believe that that was a mistake. And in a certain sense, you could argue that the Canadian gray wolf is an invasive species in Montana because it's a much bigger wolf that we believe is doing much greater predation on the wildlife herds in Montana. And of course, we believe, and the facts support us, that hunters and sportsmen are the primary group that funds the conservation of wildlife. And so in a certain sense, the wildlife herds in Montana were bought and paid for with taxes and license dollars by Montana sportsmen. And so we believe in a certain sense the federal government is basically robbing from the storehouse of wildlife that Montana sportsmen bought and paid for by pushing such a massive introduction of wolves. And if I could, at this point, I'd like to kind of walk you through 4 or 5 points that a lot of people who are not close to this issue don't understand about wolves. The first thing is that wolves are a unique critter, even from other keystone predators like grizzlies and mountain lions. I'm a very avid sportsman, okay? I have been hunting for a wolf for 3 decades. And even though I was the senator who sponsored the bill to set up wolf hunting in Montana, even though I've been hunting for wolves for 3 decades in both Montana and Alaska, I have never taken a wolf, okay? And the reason for that, and I said this when I carried the bill to set up wolf hunting in Montana, is I predicted at that point, I said, sport hunting of wolves will not solve our problem. Wolves are expanding so fast that we won't be able to maintain a limited population with just sport hunting. The population is going to explode and threaten many of our wildlife herds in Montana. And the predictions I made at that time became abundantly true over the next 15 years since I first carried that bill. Okay? The reason that wolves are unique and different from other keystone predators is that wolves, mountain lions, and grizzlies are all killing machines. But the wolf, in addition to being a killing machine, is also a breeding machine and a survival machine. Wolves have multiple broods of pups each year, unlike mountain lions and grizzlies, and wolves have 6 or 7 pups in each brood. And so, for instance, in Alaska, studies have been done during periods of time when wolves were aggressively hunted. Wolves still showed a population increase of 34% per year. 34% per year, and it doesn't take a CPA or a National Merit Scholar, which I'm both, to do that math and find out at 34% increase per year, that means 1,000% population increase within 8 years. 1,000%. The reason I call them a survival machine is wolves are incredibly intelligent and wary. At the first sound of gunshot, they become completely nocturnal. So they're a breeding machine, a killing machine, and a survival machine. So that's the first point. They're unique and they're different. And because of that, our ancestors, a century and more ago, realized that you can't manage wolves like other predators. Our ancestors didn't completely exterminate wolves just out of pure malice. They did it because they realized that there's no such thing as, oh, let's just have a few wolves around. Because even if you have a few wolves, very soon you will have too many wolves. But that's the first thing you need to understand. The second thing you need to understand is that there's a great philosophical divide in our country. I call it the Great Divide. And wolves are the perfect example to illustrate that divide. There are millions of people like me that are active hunters and outdoorsmen and sportsmen who believe that man has a vital place in managing wildlife, including predators, and that man has both the responsibility to manage wildlife populations and the privilege of harvesting wildlife populations for our own sustenance. So wolves are a perfect example to illustrate the great divide in America between two different philosophical viewpoints. One is the philosophical viewpoint of sportsmen like me who believe that man have an active place in the management of wildlife and have a responsibility to actively manage wildlife and also have the privilege to harvest wildlife for our own sustenance and needs and enjoyment. Okay? The other side of that great divide is the extreme animal rights view that somehow it is unethical or evil for man to harvest wildlife, for man to, in their view, it's an intervention in the natural order of things. The point is they argue that any such thing is intervention in the natural order and we should just restore wolves and let them control the wildlife populations. Okay, and so that's kind of the big debate, and the mistrust that has occurred is people who are sportsmen like me view wolves as the animal rights people are doing this so that they can then outlaw hunting. Because they'll say there's no need for man to control overpopulation of elk and deer because we've got these predators doing it. It's just either a true or false proposition. Either the old religious view of man versus animals is correct, or the old religious view of man versus animals is not correct. If the old religious view is correct, then man is distinct from all other creatures and has a place of responsibility and privilege to utilize those other creatures for his benefit. And clearly, some people hold to that view. My point is that even if that view is incorrect, let's say the religious view is false, well then the other option is that man is not separate and distinct from other critters, that man is just in effect another keystone predator, just like bears and wolves and mountain lions. Well, even if that's true, then man should still have the ability, without being evil or violating any ethics, of participating in the natural process just like other keystone predators. And other keystone predators, grizzlies, lions, mountain lions, and wolves not only harvest for food elk, deer, and prey species, but they also kill off competing predators. They kill off coyotes. They kill off, there are even cases in Idaho where wolves go into the den of a hibernating black bears, pull them out and kill them because they're a competing predator. So clearly, even if man is not anything more than just another keystone predator, clearly man has the right to participate in the natural balance, to participate in nature's process of maintaining populations of both predators and prey species. So part of the great divide between sportsmen and animal rights, the extreme animal rights faction, is this complete difference in philosophical perspective. But the other part of the divide is the mistrust that has grown within sportsman groups and sportsman population, because we believe that the other side has repeatedly moved the goalposts. And I'll give you a little bit of the history with wolves in Yellowstone to illustrate that, moving the goalposts. If you look at the original congressional document on reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone, it stated that number one, there would only need to be 30 breeding pairs of wolves for delisting to then occur from the Endangered Species Act. And once they were delisted, then of course the states could manage the wolf populations just like they manage elk populations and deer populations, etc. Well, that 30 breeding, it also stated there would only be roughly 78 wolves in Yellowstone, okay? The document also stated that, first of all, it documented that historically, in order to maintain the population size in an elk herd, that you would need a calf to cow ratio of roughly 30 calves for every 100 cows. If you had a 30 calf to cow ratio, that your herd size would probably maintain down through the generations of elk. And it maintained that if we reintroduce wolves, we will monitor to make sure that the calf-cow ratio doesn't drop significantly below 30 calves per 100. At the time they reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone, the northern Yellowstone elk herd was 24,000 elk. 24,000 elk, okay? Well, what happened was they kept moving the goalposts. They kept changing the definitions. First of all, they said, well, it's not going to be 30 breeding pairs. They had at one point admitted, Ed Bangs, the head of the wolf reintroduction program, admitted that they already had 46 breeding pairs and still didn't delist the wolf. Then they changed the definition of what constitutes a breeding pair. And at one point we had a wolf pack in Yellowstone called a super pack, the Druid pack, that had 47 wolves in it. And they still only counted that as one breeding pair. And so the number of wolves just skyrocketed over what they originally said they would do. We then had 550 wolves, and the net result of that was that the elk population was being decimated by wolf predation. And so I, as the vice chairman of House Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and the chairman of Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the chairman of the Fish and Game Committee, and a couple of other individuals, went and surveyed the elk down in Yellowstone ourselves to see if there was a problem, because the locals were telling us, you guys don't understand what is happening. The wolves are targeting the elk calves, and there are virtually no elk calves left. And this herd, if they keep killing all the calves, is going to hit what's called a population cliff. Once the cows in the herd get too old to breed anymore, and there's no replacement stock coming in because all the calves are being killed, then you're going to drop off a cliff. And so we went down there to survey for ourselves. We had 5 different people counting, and our survey revealed, we surveyed roughly 500 elk, our survey revealed that the calf ratio had dropped to only just over 12 calves per 100 cows. And we tried to get the press to even come with us before we did the survey, and the press wouldn't come. So afterwards, we announced it to the press. I then wrote an article that appeared not only in all the Montana newspapers, but was published nationally as well, called Sometimes Crying Wolf is a Good Thing. And I documented that we surveyed and found the calf ratio dropped to around 12 calves per 100. And even the establishment in Fish, Wildlife, and Parks said, oh, they should leave it to the professionals, because we still believe the calf ratio is up at roughly 28 to 29 calves per 100, because that's what they had counted in their previous year aerial survey. We took a lot of flack. A month down the road, they did their aerial survey, and it turned out we were virtually exactly right. They counted 13 calves per 100. We counted roughly 12 and a half calves per 100. Okay, so at that point we were exonerated, but it was on page 9 in the small print that this is exactly what we predicted was happening, and that the calves were being targeted. So at that point, I started pushing to reinstitute a wolf management plan in Montana that included sport hunting of wolves. I eventually carried the bill to do that in Montana, but I said sport hunting is not going to be enough because we waited too long, and the wolf population, as studies in Alaska shows, is going to mushroom at 34% increase per year, and our herds are going to be threatened all over Montana. So that's the first point, is that they move the goalposts over and over again. When we finally got wolves delisted and I got my bill passed, they moved the goalpost again. The animal rights and wolf advocate people found a liberal judge in Missoula, Montana, that postponed the wolf hunt for another 3 years.
How many?
3 years, while they wrangled with all different kinds of angles of why you shouldn't delist them now. And again, it's all based on their notion that they want all wolves all the time in every place, because their equation is that wolves will control all these wildlife populations so that we don't need to have humans hunting anymore. That's what it is from our perspective. Eventually, even the liberal judges in Montana agreed with us, and we got the wolf hunt established, but by then it was too late. The wolf population, it's well over 2,000 wolves in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And the Yellowstone elk herd, which once was over 24,000 elk, is now hovering down around, I haven't seen the latest count, but it's now hovering down around 4,000 elk. It fell off a population cliff just like I predicted. And in fact, if you read my original article, I said that what's going to happen is you're going to see the average population, or excuse me, the average age of this elk herd get higher and higher each year, and then it's going to fall off a population cliff. And they were aging the elk by taking the teeth out. You can age them. And sure enough, within a very short period of time, the Yellowstone elk herd became the oldest average age of any elk herd in the United States, and then it fell off a population cliff, and we're still fighting it. The net effect of that for humans is that we used to have thousands of late season elk permits where people such as myself and families would go and harvest elk that migrated out of Yellowstone. Thousands of permits, and people fed their families. Those late season hunts around Yellowstone are now completely abolished. Not only that, but the moose in Yellowstone are basically completely extinct. The bighorn sheep are basically completely extinct from all the wolf predation. Okay, so to bring you up to date with hunting of wolves in Montana and Idaho, as I predicted, just pure sport hunting wasn't going to be enough. And so since then, they have expanded what is allowable in hunting and trapping of wolves in Montana and Idaho to try to keep a lid on the mushrooming wolf population. Now any hunter can take not just 1 but 5 wolves. They increased the length of the hunting season roughly 5-fold, so it's more than half the year now. They in Idaho, they even now let you use electronic calling devices, whereas in Montana you can only use manual calling devices. They've done a number of things. Oh, and they allow trapping of wolves, which they didn't allow at first in Montana. You can either trap or hunt 5 wolves. In Idaho, they even doubled that to say you can hunt for 5 wolves and you can trap for 5 wolves, any one person. Because what they've found is it takes a real expert to be able to hunt wolves. And that's why they said, we're going to let, if someone's really good at it, we're going to let them take up to 5, because they're facing a train wreck with wolves have now migrated all over the state, the 3-state area, and in Montana now, in northern Montana, they're wiping out the white-tailed deer populations, and they're going after hunters, by the way. Hunters, bow hunters. I never used to carry a a firearm with me when I bow hunted, and I'm a very avid bow hunter. Now there's places I would not be caught dead without a firearm on my side while bow hunting, because I know of bow hunters who have had to sit up in a tree all night long because they were surrounded by a pack of wolves who are gnashing their teeth, waiting for the tender bow hunter to climb down. So that's where we're at now, and the question becomes, is there any way then that we can have wolf populations that can be maintained at reasonable levels? Or are we going to be faced with the immutable problem that our ancestors were faced with when they decided we just have to exterminate wolves because there's no such thing as just having a few nice wolves around? I'm going to make two more points about the original wolf reintroduction plan. It had two major flaws in it. They did a population study in that plan for Congress, and it had two major flaws. They said, well, you know, the wolves will eat a lot of the elk, and at some point when the prey species gets down to a certain number of elk, then the wolves will self-regulate their own population, and they won't need human intervention and hunting. The two flaws that they made was, number one, they only looked at the number of elk that wolves would eat without looking at the type of elk that the wolves would eat. And as I pointed out, how it turned out is wolves targeted the calves and targeted the deer fawns. They targeted the breed stock. And so by doing so, wolves could decimate the replacement stock for that elk herd long before the total elk herd dropped in size far enough that wolves would even think about self-regulating their own population size. So it was a major flaw. The other major flaw is they didn't, you know, they looked at other wildlife species and they said, well, these species self-regulate their own population, so wolves will do the same thing. If the prey species becomes too few, they'll regulate their population as well. Well, what they didn't consider is that wolves are by nature a non-territorial marauding species. And so, you know, while their plan might have worked if it was on an island somewhere where the wolves couldn't escape, that would have been fine. But in Yellowstone, what happened is they decimated the elk calf population and then just exploded to everywhere else in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, because because new wolf packs established themselves, just exponentially mushrooming out. And so now they're threatening elk populations all over Montana and deer populations as well. So those were the two major flaws in the original population model that they used. Believe it or not, you can even make a case that wolves engage in sport hunting. I can show you pictures where wolves have come in, they call it surplus killing instinct, okay? Where wolves have come in and decimated herds of bighorn sheep and photographs of just all the bighorn sheep laying there dead with hardly anything eaten off of any of the sheep because the wolf pack engaged in what's called surplus killing instinct, where they just came in not killing bighorn sheep or other prey species for sustenance, but killing them in effect for the sport of it. I can show you pictures of doe deer where the wolves came in, a pregnant deer, tore the fetuses from the doe deer, then tore open the fetuses and ate only the liver from the fetuses and left the mother and the baby deer to just die and waste, okay? And so, again, if man is nothing more than just another predator, there are activities that predators engage in to sharpen their skills and to limit other prey species, other predator species as well. I've found mountain lion cubs out hunting that were killed either by a male mountain lion or perhaps by a bear, but just killed and left, not to be eaten, but just killed because they're killing a competing predator species. Okay, so, but secondly, my second answer to that is, I think sport hunting, that the animal rights groups have been effective because they've got a lot of media on their side, etc., have been effective in redefining what sport hunting is all about. I don't define sport hunting as I shot all these critters because I like to have horns, okay? For me and for 99.9% of other sportsman hunters, it's the adventure that we're after. It's the challenge that we're after. It's the pursuing something that presses our skills and our physical abilities that we're after. It's not horns that we're after. I mean, it's nice when you get a horn critter, but it's a very, very small, and finally, and the most important factor is it's providing for our families a source of protein that is completely natural, has no chemicals in it, no steroids in it, none of the problems that you have with commercial beef and commercial chickens and all that other stuff. It's providing a way of life for our families that we believe is extremely healthy, much more healthy than just relying on the commercial butchering and feedlot process. So that's what sport hunting is to me. But I will agree with you, the left has very effectively redefined sport hunting as somehow it's a guy just looking to put horns on his wall. All I can tell you is it finally got to the point in Montana, before we set up legalized hunting of wolves, it finally got to the point where even the folks in charge of the wolf reintroduction program realized, my gosh, we're headed for a train wreck. Especially when the animal rights people got a judge to delay the hunting season for another 3 years. At that point, even the people who were the government agencies in charge of wolf reintroduction started using whatever excuse they could to wipe out a wolf pack here, wipe out another one here. If one llama was killed by one wolf over by Missoula, the government professionals would come in and wipe out the whole wolf pack. And they did this over and over and over again because they realized, no, it's not working. If I were a Colorado State legislator, I would not go forward with wolf reintroduction unless they got some very hard, concrete, in writing assurances from the feds that these are goalposts that will not be moved. And in fact, what I would probably do is, in addition to target numbers of wolf population, I would also have a date in concrete that wolves will be allowed to be managed by state wildlife agencies, including hunting and trapping, by this date certain or before, if the population gets to a certain level before. So both a population cap and a date cap. Is there any possibility of bridging the Great Divide? Is there any way that we can, the two sides can come to a meeting of the minds? I believe that the only way the two sides can come to a meeting of the minds is if cooler heads prevail on the animal rights extremist side. At some point, they got to recognize that wolves are a unique critter because they're a killing machine, a breeding machine, and a survival machine all rolled into one. They got to recognize that wolves are not going to self-regulate their population size, and that man must be an integral part of managing wolf populations. Man, and I mean man in terms of sportsman hunting, trapping, and even government agencies in many cases having to aggressively harvest wolf packs, etc., to keep the wolf population from mushrooming. Short of that, I don't see any way that the two sides of the Great Divide can come to a compromise on this issue, and we can have wolves in the natural balance of things without having wolves decimate the storehouse of wildlife, elk, deer, and other prey species.